Welcome back, focused learners. Today we're jumping straight into another deep dive explainer. We are conducting a really rigorous textual investigation into what is arguably one of the most dense, debated, and just absolutely fascinating passages in all of Scripture. We're looking at Dr. Robert Peterson's masterful theological breakdown of Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 19. If you love unpacking complex grammatical puzzles and deep theological mysteries, you are in exactly the right place today. So let's just dive right into this. To really wrap our heads around Romans 5, we actually have to start a bit earlier in the text with a massive foundational question. And it kind of flips our usual assumptions upside down. A lot of people will ask, how could a loving God punish anyone? But Dr. Peterson points out that, biblically speaking, that's actually the easy question to answer. A holy, completely just God can easily condemn a sinful world. The true core biblical puzzle is actually this: how can a holy God maintain his absolute moral integrity and justice while simultaneously saving the guilty? Here is our agenda for this investigation. 1. Justification and propitiation. 2. The two intruders. 3. The exegetical dilemma. 4. 5 views on law. And 5. The reign of death. Section 1. Justification and propitiation, the foundation. Before Paul even touches the concept of original sin in Romans 5, he spends the first few chapters laying down the absolute foundation of the gospel, which is the revelation of the saving righteousness of God. And that brings us directly to the answer of how God can be perfectly just and still justify sinners. The answer is propitiation. Propitiation is Christ's atoning death that actually satisfies the righteous demands of God's nature, turning away that divine wrath. Dr. Peterson notes something pretty amazing here. In Old Testament times, God forgave believers in the prospect of this future atonement. Those animal sacrifices, they were just a picture. God passed over former sins, looking forward to the exact moment Christ would step in as the ultimate propitiation. And this brilliantly illustrates the connection between Romans 3 and Romans 5. In Romans 3, Paul is explaining the negative side of the atonement. Think of it as the subtraction. Christ's death turns away God's wrath. But when we arrive at Romans 5, verses 12 through 21, Dr. Peterson argues we're now seeing the positive side, the addition. This is all about Christ procuring righteousness for believers. So, before we get completely into the weeds of original sin, we have to keep in mind that Romans 5 is fundamentally about the saving righteousness of Christ acting as the very basis of our justification. Section 2. The two intruders. Sin and death enter the world. With that grand foundation laid out, Paul zooms right in on the problem of humanity in verse 12. And he introduces two antagonists. Now, they aren't just abstract concepts, they are heavily personified forces. The theologian Anders Nygren perfectly captures how these forces operate. He says, sin and death are in the world as tyrants, who do not ask a man whether he will serve them, but rule automatically. Basically, Adam's primal sin acted like a cracked door that allowed these two intruders to gain entrance into the human world, where they rule over all humankind without ever asking for our permission.
Section 3. The exegetical dilemma, a broken sentence and a structural clue.
Okay, but as we read verse 12 to see exactly how these intruders entered, we hit a totally famous textual roadblock. Paul is writing along, he's setting up this massive theological comparison, and then he just stops. His thought breaks off right in the middle. Grammatically speaking, it's what scholars call a protasis without an apodosis. Simply put, it's an if clause without a then clause. Paul starts this comparative thought, just as sin entered the world through one man. But he gets so sidetracked by his own profound theology that he actually forgets to provide the conclusion, the so also righteousness part, until we get all the way down to verses 18 and 19. But even though the sentence breaks off, Paul masterfully structures what is there using a chiastic structure. That's an A, B, B prime, A prime pattern. Let's look at the logical steps. He starts with the presence of sin, which is A, which leads to the presence of death, B. Then he flips it, showing the spread or universality of death to all men, B prime, because of the universality of sin, A prime. It's brilliant. He perfectly links the entrance of these intruders directly to their universal spread across all of humanity. Now, historically, interpreting that final little phrase, because all sinned, has created a massive theological divide. The Western Church historically interpreted this to mean we all sinned corporately in Adam. Like when he sinned, we were fundamentally tied to him. Meanwhile, the Eastern Church has historically leaned toward the view that this means we all sinned personally and individually, simply following Adam's example. This raises the ultimate exegetical issue for us. How do we actually account for one man sinning and all men dying?
Section 4. 5 views on law, the sticky wicket of Romans 5:13b.
To find the answer to this divide, Paul forces us into verses 13 and 14. Dr. Peterson humorously calls this section a sticky wicket, and you'll see why. To anchor ourselves, let's think about this chronologically. You have Adam way at the beginning committing the primal sin, then you have Moses much, much later receiving the specific Mosaic law. But in between them, you have this vast middle gap, the pre-law era. Paul tells us sin was definitely in the world during this time, but there was no express written law yet. And this brings up a really major logical problem, which Paul addresses using what linguists call a gnomic present. That's just a statement of the regular state of affairs. He writes, sin is not counted where there is no law. The logic makes total sense, right? Normally, you can't be charged with a crime or a sin if there literally isn't a specific law on the books to break. So if there was no law between Adam and Moses, how on earth could sin be counted against those people? To try and solve this puzzle, Dr. Peterson impartially outlines 5 major scholarly views. First up, the social diatribe view. This suggests Paul is just arguing rhetorically with an imaginary opponent. Second, we have the absolute sense view. This one says that because the law didn't apply yet, death in that era was actually caused by Adam's corporate sin, not personal sin. Third, that there was a law then view, which argues that God's law was written on their hearts, so personal sin was indeed counted. Fourth is the relative or comparative view, famously held by Calvin, suggesting sin simply wasn't as sharply defined then as it was later under Moses. And fifth, the sin versus transgression view. This draws a line between broad sinfulness and the specific, guilty infraction of a known, express command. As you can probably guess, there is a massive amount of dense academic debate here. The sheer volume of text required to unpack verse 13b is staggering. Without even taking sides, we can really appreciate that rigorous exegetical work, literally digging into the original Greek and the deep historical context, is the only real way to unpack what Paul meant. Section 5, the reign of death, from Adam to Moses. Now, regardless of which view you lean toward regarding the law, verse 14 states an absolute historical fact. During that middle gap from Adam to Moses, the intruder death absolutely reigned as a king. The crucial takeaway is that death reigned even without express prohibitions. Think about it. Adam was given a direct "thou shalt not." The people living between Adam and Moses were not given express commands in that same way, so they didn't sin in the exact likeness of Adam's direct transgression, yet death still acted as a tyrant over them. Dr. Peterson points out that this universal reign of death applied even to infants, or those completely incapable of personal transgression or understanding special revelation. Because of this stark reality, scholars like C.S. Lewis Johnson argue that the only logical explanation for this universal reign of death is humanity's foundational solidarity in Adam's sin. And that leaves us with one final, deeply provocative question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. If we are completely solidary with Adam, how exactly does that work? Are we looking at realism, meaning humanity was physically, realistically present in the loins of Adam when he sinned? Or are we looking at representation, where Adam was simply acting as our natural federal head and representative in the garden? It's a profound theological mystery about original sin, and it perfectly sets the stage for the glorious, imputed righteousness of Christ that Paul promises will reign in life. Keep exploring, keep learning, and thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Romans 5.